For most people, the letter O on a medical chart is nothing more than a label, something a nurse checks before a transfusion and then quickly moves past. But imagine that one tiny symbol is actually the final page of a story that began thousands of years before your family had a surname, before anyone drew a national border, and before human beings had a written history to remember themselves by. If you carry O-positive blood, the cells moving through your veins may be carrying clues about ancient populations that survived harsh environments and deadly invisible enemies. And the deeper scientists look, the stranger the story becomes, because your blood type is not simply a medical category. It is the result of an evolutionary battle that played out across continents, diseases, and generations. For a long time, blood type was treated almost like an administrative detail. Doctors needed to know it because mixing incompatible blood could be deadly. That was the practical explanation. But blood is not simply a red liquid moving through your body. It is a biological system built from genetic instructions. And those instructions have been shaped by the environment over immense periods of time. To understand why O-positive is so common in some populations and far less common in others, we have to go back to the moment modern medicine first realized that human blood was not all the same. At the beginning of the 20th century, blood transfusions were still dangerously unpredictable. A transfusion could save a life, but doctors had no reliable way to know whether one person's blood would be accepted by another person's body. The mystery began to change in 1901 when Austrian scientist Karl Landsteiner carefully studied what happened when different blood samples were mixed together. Some combinations remained smooth. Others reacted violently, causing red blood cells to clump together. That discovery led to the recognition of the major ABO blood groups, A, B, and O. It was one of the breakthroughs that transformed modern transfusion medicine. But the discovery created another problem. Once scientists had these categories, they began trying to figure out which blood type came first. And early researchers made an assumption that seems almost obvious when you look at the populations they were studying. Type A was common throughout much of Europe. So some scientists began treating A as if it represented the original human condition. Type O, in their minds, appeared to be a simpler variation that had emerged later. The problem was that human history does not begin in the laboratories of Europe. When geneticists eventually moved beyond the visible characteristics of blood and began examining the DNA behind them, the old assumptions started to collapse. The ABO blood group is connected to a gene on chromosome 9. That gene controls the production of enzymes involved in building molecular structures called antigens on the surface of red blood cells. Type A and Type B blood carry different versions of these structures. Type O is different because the relevant gene variation does not produce the same functional enzyme, leaving the red cell without A or B antigens. That may sound like a tiny molecular difference, but when researchers began comparing these genetic patterns across human populations, the geography became impossible to ignore. Type A was common in many European populations. Type B showed strong concentrations in parts of Asia and other regions. But among indigenous populations of the Americas, Type O appeared at astonishingly high frequencies. In some communities, the proportion was so high that nearly the entire population carried Type O. This was not a random coincidence. Geneticists recognized a pattern known as the founder effect. Imagine a very small group of people leaving a much larger population and settling somewhere new. The genetic traits carried by that original group can become extremely common in their descendants, not because the trait suddenly becomes stronger, but because the founding population was small to begin with. If most of those first settlers carried a particular blood type, generations later, that blood type could dominate the population. And that immediately raised a much bigger question. Who were the ancestors of those first American populations? The evidence from archaeology and genetics points back toward Asia. Ancient human populations moved through the northern regions of the continent and eventually entered the Americas. The exact details of every migration route continue to be studied, but the broader ancestry connection is clear. The people who eventually populated the Americas carried genetic signatures inherited from ancient Asian populations. And among many of these groups, Type O became extraordinarily common. The story becomes even more interesting when you look across Asia itself. Type O remains a major part of the genetic landscape in many Asian populations. In the Philippines, it represents roughly 45% of the population. In Vietnam, it is around 42%. These numbers vary depending on the population and the data being examined, but the larger pattern is difficult to miss. When scientists compare the genetic markers surrounding the ABO gene, they can find clues that connect modern populations to much older ancestral movements. The blood type did not suddenly appear in one modern country. It traveled with people. And then, evolution adds another layer to the mystery. Why would a particular blood type become so common in certain ancient populations? What made it survive generation after generation? The answer may be hidden in the enemies humans could not see. For most of human history, the greatest threats were not always armies or predators. Microscopic organisms killed enormous numbers of people. Parasites, bacteria, and viruses could move through communities without warning. A population could spend generations living under pressure from disease, and over time, even small differences in survival could shape the genetic makeup of the people who remained. Blood type became part of that biological battlefield. Take malaria. The disease has challenged human populations for an incredibly long time. The parasite enters the bloodstream and infects red blood cells. But red blood cells with different surface structures do not behave identically when exposed to disease. Type O blood appears to offer an important advantage against malaria's most dangerous complications. When infected red blood cells interact with healthy cells, they can form clusters and attach to blood vessel walls. This process can contribute to severe disease. Type O cells are less likely to form this same kind of rosettes, which is one reason researchers have associated type O with a lower risk of severe malaria outcomes compared with some other blood types. That does not mean a person with type O blood is immune to malaria. They are not. But in an environment where malaria repeatedly kills people before they reach adulthood, even a modest survival advantage can matter enormously. A person who survives has a greater chance of having children. Those children inherit the genes. Over many generations, a small advantage can become a major population pattern. And this is where the ancient story of human migration becomes far more complicated than a simple map showing arrows moving across Asia. The people who traveled through different environments were not just carrying tools and language, they were carrying biological traits that interacted with every new disease ecosystem they encountered. Then there is another microscopic enemy that reveals a different side of the blood type story. Norovirus is extremely contagious. It can move rapidly through communities and spread wherever people are living close together. Some strains interact with specific carbohydrate structures found on cells in the digestive tract. Those structures are connected to the genetic systems that also influence blood group expression. The relationship is complicated, and not every strain behaves the same way. But researchers have observed differences in susceptibility among blood types. In some cases, people with type O may have a reduced risk of infection from particular norovirus strains because the virus cannot attach to the same target structures as easily. Again, this is not a magical shield. It is a biological difference. But over thousands of years, biological differences are exactly what natural selection notices. Imagine two people living in a prehistoric community during a period of disease. One person becomes severely ill and dies. The other experiences a milder infection and survives. The difference may have come down to a tiny molecular detail neither person could see or understand. That survivor eventually has children, and those children inherit the same biological blueprint. This is how a genetic trait can quietly travel through history. But nature does not give one population a perfect body. Every advantage comes with trade-offs. The same blood characteristics that may help in one environment can create problems in another. This is where the story of O blood takes an unexpected turn, because the disease that made type O useful against severe malaria is not the only disease humans have faced. In regions where cholera has historically caused devastating outbreaks, researchers have observed a very different pattern. Cholera bacteria produce toxins that disrupt the body's ability to control fluids. Severe infection can lead to extreme dehydration, and blood type appears to influence the risk of serious disease. People with type O blood have been associated with a higher risk of severe cholera outcomes compared with some other blood groups. Think about what that means from an evolutionary perspective. In one environment, type O may provide an advantage against one deadly disease. In another environment, the same blood type may increase vulnerability to a different threat. There is no universal winner. The environment keeps changing the rules. This may help explain why blood types are distributed differently across the world. The genetic map of humanity is not random. It is a record of countless interactions between people and the places where they lived. In 1952, doctors in Bombay, now known as Mumbai, encountered a medical mystery that seemed to challenge everything they knew about blood transfusion. A patient tested as type O. On paper, that should have meant standard O blood was compatible. But when the transfusion was attempted, the patient's body reacted in a dangerous way. The question was obvious. How could O blood reject O blood? The answer revealed that blood typing is far more complicated than 4 letters on a chart. To understand the mystery, imagine building a house. Type A blood has one kind of molecular structure on the surface of the red blood cell. Type B has another. Type AB has both. Type O has neither A nor B. But all of these blood types normally rely on a basic molecular foundation called the H antigen. The patient in Bombay did not have that foundation. This rare genetic condition became known as the Bombay phenotype. At first glance, it can look like type O because the A and B antigens are absent. But genetically and biologically, it is fundamentally different. The person does not simply lack the A or B structures. They lack the basic structure needed to build them in the normal way. That creates a serious transfusion problem. A person with the Bombay phenotype generally cannot safely receive ordinary O blood. They need blood from another donor with the same rare phenotype. In most populations around the world, this condition is extraordinarily rare, appearing in roughly 1 person per million. But in parts of the Indian subcontinent, it is significantly more common, with estimates around 1 in 10,000 people. And suddenly, the story of blood type becomes something much more personal. A standard blood test can give you a label, but hidden beneath that label may be a genetic history that the basic test cannot fully reveal. The Bombay phenotype is a reminder that human biology is full of layers. A person can appear to belong to one category while carrying a completely different genetic story underneath. And if you zoom out from that one rare condition, the entire journey of type O becomes even more remarkable. Thousands of years ago, human populations continued moving across Asia. Some traveled north, some moved south. Others followed coastlines and rivers. Eventually, people crossed oceans that early humans had no maps to describe. Around 5,000 years ago, seafaring populations from the region of Taiwan began an extraordinary expansion across the Pacific. They developed sophisticated outrigger canoes and navigational traditions that allowed them to travel enormous distances across open water. They reached islands scattered across the largest ocean on Earth, including Hawaii, New Zealand, and Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. The journeys were astonishing because these were not short coastal trips. These people were moving into isolated environments separated by vast stretches of ocean. And as their descendants spread across the Pacific, genetic studies found high levels of type O in many Polynesian populations. Now compare that with the indigenous populations of the Americas. The two regions are separated by an immense ocean. Their histories are distinct. Their cultures are distinct. Yet both populations carry genetic patterns connected to ancient Asian ancestry, including a strong presence of type O. That is the part that makes blood type feel almost like a historical map. A person living thousands of miles from Asia may still carry genetic markers inherited from populations that left the continent long before written records existed. The ocean did not erase the genetic past. The people carried it with them. And the story does not end with ancient migration. Modern medicine continues to uncover how blood type may influence life today. One of the most interesting differences involves blood clotting. On average, people with type O blood tend to have lower levels of certain clotting proteins, including von Willebrand factor and factor VIII, compared with people who have non-O blood types. That difference is associated with a lower average risk of some venous thromboembolic events and certain clot-related cardiovascular problems. But the same biology can create a trade-off. Lower levels of clotting factors may also be associated with a higher tendency toward bleeding. In simple terms, the blood may be slightly less likely to form certain dangerous clots, but it may also take a little longer to stop bleeding in some situations. Again, nature is balancing the equation. There is no perfect blood type. There is only a set of biological advantages and disadvantages shaped by thousands of years of human survival. And that brings us back to the question most people never ask. What does your blood type actually say about you? If you are O positive, it does not tell you exactly where your ancestors came from. It cannot identify a specific tribe, village, or ancient family. Blood type is not a genetic passport with a precise address printed inside it, but it is one piece of a much larger biological story.
Your blood group reflects variations in your DNA. Those variations exist within populations that have moved, mixed, survived, and changed over enormous stretches of time. The letter O did not appear because your ancestors were somehow chosen by history. It survived because human populations faced different pressures in different environments. Some of those pressures came from parasites. Some came from bacteria. Some came from viruses. Some came from the climate and the conditions surrounding ancient communities. And while people were fighting for survival, their genes were quietly being passed from one generation to the next. Think about how strange that is. Your ancestors did not know what a blood type was. They had no idea what a chromosome was. They could not see a malaria parasite under a microscope. They could not understand why one person became severely ill while another recovered. Yet their bodies were still responding to those challenges. The survivors passed their biological traits forward. Their descendants moved. They crossed rivers. They entered colder regions. They traveled through tropical environments. Some crossed land that no longer exists. Others crossed oceans in wooden canoes. And eventually, generations later, the same genetic blueprint arrived in you. That is why blood can be viewed as a kind of biological archive. Not a perfect record, not a complete family tree, but a record of ancient variation that has survived the test of time. And O positive has one of the most widespread and fascinating stories of all. The next time you see the letter O followed by a plus sign on a medical form, it is easy to ignore it. Most people do. It looks like a simple category, but behind that category is a much longer story. Somewhere in the distant past, people carrying similar genetic traits were living through a world where disease could wipe out entire communities. They were moving through environments that were sometimes freezing, sometimes humid, sometimes filled with parasites and microscopic threats no human could see. Their bodies were not perfect. Their blood did not make them invincible. It simply interacted with the world in a particular way. Sometimes that interaction helped. Sometimes it created a new vulnerability. But the people who carried those genes continued to live, have children, and pass the blueprint forward. Generation after generation, the genetic signature moved across Asia, reached the Americas, traveled into the Pacific, and remained inside human populations long enough for modern science to finally begin reading the clues. So if you carry O positive blood, you are not looking at a magic symbol. You are looking at one small piece of a story that began before history had a written language. Your blood does not remember your ancestors in the way a human remembers a face. It remembers them through biology, through genes, through molecular structures that have survived countless generations. And perhaps that is the most incredible part of the entire story. You do not need to know the names of the people who came before you to carry something they left behind. Their lives ended. Their settlements disappeared. Their languages changed. Their borders vanished. But some of their biological history continued. It traveled quietly through their descendants. And eventually, it reached you. And eventually, it reached you.